Oh, sorry about my other video being cut off. I had to attend to the phone. So yeah, I was just saying about having a flu vaccine tomorrow and how that makes me worried because of my hypochondria, but at the same time, it's good to get it done and dusted, and then I'll be getting my COVID vaccine mid-October. So yeah, stressful times, but it's got to be done. I don't have an option. Lots of chocolate needed afterwards, that's for certain. But yeah, in today's video though, what I really wanted to talk about was empathy, because I was talking about it in last week's video, and I was sort of talking about my own views on the matter and why I do feel that people are confused by empathy and they think it to mean different things to what it actually means. And I came across an article from Vox magazine that I wanted to share, and the title is we should be compassionate, not empathetic. That's the argument of the article. It's from Vox magazine. So Paul Bloom, who's Professor of Psychology at Yale University in America, has written a book entitled Against Empathy, and it's a book I actually want to read. It's on my reading list. He argues that empathy is actually a poor guide for moral reasoning. He says there is value in having conscious, deliberative reasoning in everyday life. We should try to use our heads rather than our hearts. Some people take empathy to mean everything good or moral, and he is not against that. Neither is he against understanding people, which is a sort of narrower view of empathy. Empathy is used to understand people, so he's not against that either. But he says that empathy can also be a force for evil. So although empathy does have its good side, if it genuinely enables people to understand others, and maybe in that sense facilitates moral actions, it is not unambiguously good either, because it can actually be used as a force for evil. Empathy, the definition of empathy he provides is that empathy is the feeling the feelings of other people. So if you're in pain and I feel your pain, that is empathy. I guess that's the kind of affective side of empathy. Affective empathy would be, say, someone's feeling anxious, and then the other person sort of mirrors that and starts feeling anxious themselves. That's affective empathy. And I would say, as an autistic person, I do have affective empathy, I think, in the sense that, like, say if I was speaking to my dad and he's, like, stressing with me, I pick up on the mood and it makes me stressed too. Although I'm not very good necessarily at picking up on my emotions, but I definitely feel kind of a sort of negative vibe, if you like, when I'm around people who are negative. I do pick up on it. So that shows I am picking up on their effect, and that is affective empathy, basically. But obviously having that affective empathy is not in and of itself going to help you get by in social situations, because it's what you do with that information which is important. You might have affective empathy, but if you're not going to do anything with that information to kind of facilitate a social communication, a social interaction, then it doesn't really mean very much. And I think that's part of the issue, that autistics, generally speaking, do have affective empathy. Some have it to an extremely high extent. But if you're going to get overwhelmed by that, and if it's going to make you want to kind of run away and demotivate you because it's so overwhelming, then that you might have the kind of you might be having an empathic response, but you still might not necessarily behave empathetically, or you might not necessarily or you might be motivated to help, but you might not help the other person in the way they want. So you might experience empathy, and you might be trying to empathise, but if you're not helping the other person in the way they want you to, then you're not actually being empathetic as such. Just to be genuinely empathetic means that your actions are also desirable. And I think that's the problem in autism. So it's not that autistic people lack empathy as such, and I think that's the mistaken notion. It's that autistics struggle with a follow-through. It's not that autistics don't care, autistics do care, but they struggle with the follow-through because they do have a problem with empathy, and we mustn't shy away from that. And particularly with cognitive empathy, which autistics, that's the part of empathy that autistics really do struggle with, is the sort of getting inside someone else's shoes type of empathy. Now obviously this varies among different autistics, and some will have more difficulty with this than others, and it is possible to some extent to learn this. So some autistics might have it in a learnt way, like a sort of intellectual way. It's possible to actually intellectually try and learn how to get into someone else's shoes. So it's not like a blanket autistics can't do it. It's just that it does make it a hell of a lot harder, and indeed some autistic people really struggle to put themselves in other people's shoes. I would actually say I really struggle with that. I happen to have the awareness that I struggle with it, and not all autistics have that awareness. Some autistics struggle with it and actually think they don't struggle with it, but that's kind of down to a lack of awareness. I struggle with it, and I know I struggle with it, but I can't really do anything about it because I really do struggle with it. But like I said, empathy is people get the wrong idea about empathy because they equate empathy with your ability to care when it is completely separate. And sympathy, I've been thinking more about sympathy and how sympathy is different to empathy. And sympathy is related to affective empathy, but it's different. Insofar as affective empathy is when you feel someone else's emotion, like a sort of mirroring. So you're literally in that other person's shoes. When you're experiencing affective empathy, your feelings are the same as the other person. You don't have to understand the other person, and you don't have to understand their perspective. That's cognitive empathy, that's theory of mind, which is kind of more higher order empathy, where you're really trying to understand the other person's position. Because you could have affective empathy and not actually understand the person and not be able to mentalise. So an autistic person might have affective empathy, mirroring the emotions of the other person, and maybe might not even be aware that's what's happening. But again, particularly if you don't really realise, or you're not really get clued up onto your feelings or whatever, you might not even know it's happening. Or I think some autistics sometimes shut down from those emotions because they're too overwhelming, and I've sort of learned to do that as I've got older as well, which again can give the impression that I don't care. It's actually I do care, it's just I care too much and the feelings are too painful, so I'm trying to shut down from them. But again, it doesn't really encourage an empathetic response, unfortunately, because you're so busy trying to deal with your own emotions, you're not really helping the other person. So it's still a deficit in empathy, I would say, even if you are feeling affective empathy. So autistics do have feelings. It's often the fact that we have too strong feelings, but it's that we get overwhelmed with them. And sympathy, by the way, is related to affective empathy, but unlike affective empathy, in sympathy you don't have to feel what the other person is feeling. Being sympathy is all about you. So you might feel sorry for the other person, you might pity them, you might dislike the fact they're suffering, you might say to them, for example, I'm sorry about what has happened, I pity you, I feel really bad for you. And you might feel uncomfortable about what's going on, but it's all about you. Your emotions won't be tallying with what the other person is experiencing. They might even be completely different to what the other person is experiencing, because it's all about you. You haven't kind of shared their emotions. That's the next step up. That's affective empathy. Your experience, it's very egocentric, is sympathy in a sense. You feel sorry for the other person, but you don't have to empathise with them, because to empathise is where you put yourself in the other person's shoes, either emotionally or cognitively, or ideally both. I think autistics do feel sympathy, like we care about other people, so we feel pity for them, we feel bad for other people, but we can do that without having to feel what they're feeling. So empathy is feeling the feelings of other people. That's affective empathy. If you're in pain, I feel your pain. And like I said, autistics, as a rule, do have that type of empathy. So it's not like autistics completely struggle with empathy. It generally is the cognitive side of empathy that autistics struggle with the most. Now, compassion is when you give someone else's concern weight. So you care about them, but you don't necessarily pick up your feelings. So compassion is kind of more similar to sympathy, but it's the next step up from sympathy. Sympathy is more passive. You can feel sorry for someone, but it doesn't necessarily drive you to be compassionate towards them. So just feeling sorry shows you care, because you have to care to feel sorry, but you don't necessarily feel motivated then to kind of help them. To feel motivated to help them, you either have to experience empathy or you have to experience compassion. Basically, you can experience compassion without having empathy, is what this article is saying. You don't have to have empathy to be compassionate. So compassion is when you give their concern weight. So you don't just passively feel sorry for them, you actually give their concern weight. You deeply care about them, but you don't necessarily pick up on their feelings. Now, empathy is actually exhausting because it can actually result in people avoiding helping others. Because empathy, if you're feeling someone else's feelings and that's full on and overwhelming, it can actually demotivate you from helping other people. Like I said earlier, myself shutting down because it's too overwhelming, that isn't conducive to helping others. Because if your feelings are too painful and you shut down, and that can also make it appear to others that you don't care, it could be opposites because you care too much. Because if you didn't care at all, you wouldn't be feeling any pain. The fact that I feel uncomfortable shows that I do care. It basically is very overwhelming for me because I can't deal with negative emotions. Like, I can't deal with extremes of any emotion, but particularly not negative emotions. So I sort of shut down to avoid having to deal with it, but unfortunately that means I could come across as not caring. Now, empathy is biased towards people like you. Empathy is actually very, very tribal. We tend to experience more empathy towards those who are in the same group as us, who have the same colour of skin, the same political views, live in the same country, the same economic group, so on and so on and so on. That's just an unfortunate fact of human life. We tend to empathise more with people who are like us. And that's the case for everyone. Empathy is selective, it's not universal. It's not possible for empathy to be universal because it's a limited, finite resource. You can't you can't empathise for everyone all the time because that would be exhausting. No one can do that. People experience selective empathy. People can also turn their empathy on and off because to have it on all the time would be absolutely exhausting, and no person on this earth, even the most empathetic, caring person, can be switched on all the time. It's just not possible. So, by definition, empathy is biased as well towards people like you. So the article argues that it's actually much better off if we don't value empathy quite so highly. Empathy can be important, but it doesn't in and of itself result in compassionate behaviour. We maybe need to be more rational deliberators, motivated by compassion and care for others. And I was thinking that's quite like autistic people. Like, autistics struggle with empathy, particularly cognitive empathy. But autistic people, that doesn't mean autistic people are not caring. Obviously, autistic people are just like anyone else. You can get caring autistic people and very uncaring autistic people. People are people. But being autistic in and of itself doesn't make autistics any less caring than anyone else. Autistics can be very compassionate without having a lot of empathy because they're separate things. For example, he gave an example of Trump, because this is an American writer, President Trump, when Trump was president, appealing to the empathy of his supporters in his anti-Muslim rhetoric. For example, he honed in on the suffering Muslims supposedly caused to his group. So it's very, very tribal. It was like us-them rhetoric, like basically demonising Muslims, othering them, and making it out like they'd cause loads of problems and they'd cause a lot of suffering, and then he was basically drawing upon the empathy of his supporters in a very tribal way. So it's not the case that not so nice people don't experience empathy. Of course they do. like the supporters of Hitler and the Nazi Party experienced empathy. They experienced empathy towards people like them, and they directed their animosity against those they saw as others, such as the Jews in that case, seeing the Jews as causing suffering or whatever. And then it was their empathy that led them to like extreme actions to protect their group against this perceived threat, which shows that having empathy can actually result in evil. It's not unequivocally good. So like people who don't have much empathy or struggle with empathy, it doesn't mean they're not caring. It can actually mean a complete opposite, and that can potentially mean they're less likely to do those things. It's not the same as psychopathy, that's completely different. In actual fact, psychopaths have the opposite problem. They have extreme cognitive empathy or theory of mind, but they basically don't. But they basically don't care. And the other thing about psychopaths, by the way, is that they can turn their empathy on and off, and they can use it to their own nefarious ends. Like they can basically identify with their victims to such an extent and understand them so well that they know exactly how to manipulate them. And the other thing about psychopaths is they can still experience empathy towards their family, which is why people are often surprised. Oh, he was the paragon of the community. Oh, he was such a loving father, husband. Well, of course, because a psychopath can experience empathy and does experience empathy, and it's done selectively. So that's a complete myth about psychopaths not having empathy. They do have empathy. What they lack is compassion and caring, which are separate things. They can be related to empathy, but clearly not always. They can exist without empathy, and empathy can exist without compassion and caring. Or it can exist with selective compassion and caring. For example, a psychopath can be very compassionate towards his family or very caring towards their family, but at the same time can switch that caring off and be very, very cold and calculating as well. So that's a complete myth. We must get rid of that myth. It's causing so much damage, and unfortunately it's leading to this myth about autism and empathy, which is completely inaccurate. Yes, autistics do struggle with empathy. We must not be politically correct about it. It's a fact backed up by science, and it actually means autistics are the complete opposite to psychopaths. We must get that out there. It's very important. Because as it says here as well, empathy also can result in anger towards those people that the empathiser sees as causing suffering towards their in-group. So it can also cause very extreme negative emotions as well, which shows that maybe people who struggle with empathy, like autistics, are potentially less likely to be tribal, maybe less likely to want to go to war, maybe less likely to be extremely patriotic in a kind of jingoistic way. Like, because if you struggle with empathy, you're not going to be so motivated, you're not going to be so able to be, what's the word for it, susceptible to group emotion, to tribalism, to religion, to all those other rituals and group interactions that require affiliation with a all-encompassing belief system, which can become totalitarian, which is part of the reason why autistics were a really big threat to the Nazi regime, because autistics did not make good Nazis. That's part of the reason why Hitler hated them, part of the reason why so many autistics ended up in concentration camps, because a lot of autistics did not go along with the Nazi regime, because they couldn't go along, because they didn't have the empathy to go along with it. They weren't stepping in time with it. So, far from it being, obviously struggling with empathy can make lives really hard, because humans are social creatures, and empathy is the glue that binds people together, and that's what autism is, a disability. So it is obviously far preferable to have empathy, but it's not an unambiguously bad thing not to have it either. So thank you for watching.